That's what we need, people shaking hands. No, he's an ag. I think this one's an ag, isn't it?
It's transportation.
Oh, transportation. Oh. Purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4996 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4996, a bill to amend Title 46, United States Code, with respect to prohibited acts by ocean common carriers or marine terminal operators and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, and the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 4996 as amended.
Without objection?
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman of the committee, Mr. DeFazio. Congressman Dusty Johnson and I have announced our intention to pursue this bipartisan legislation, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, just this past June. In late August, we introduced the H.R. 4996 and have since earned the support of more than 90 bipartisan co-sponsors. On November 17th, the Biden administration put out a public statement endorsing our bipartisan bill. Now, less than 4 months since we first began to develop this legislation, I am thrilled. In fact, I am awed and I'm amazed, but very happy that the House is taking up our comprehensive reform. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, reflects relatively minor changes and a reorganization of H.R. 4996 as introduced. In other words, it's not important to the substance of the bill. I am thrilled with the compromised legislative text reached by the committee's majority and minority staff and the members. This is what the voters sent us here to do, to identify problems, develop practical solutions, and then work together across the aisle to reach a compromise to achieve a result. That's exactly what the House, both Democrats and Republicans, are now doing in taking up this bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021 on this day. I want to thank Mr. DeFazio and Mr. Carbajal and the ranking member, Sam Graves, and Mr. Gibbs of Ohio for working with us, with me and my Republican counterpart, Mr. Johnson, from South Dakota to get this result. I'll very, very briefly go through what the bill attempts to do. We all are aware that the pandemic made the longstanding issues of ocean shipping industry highlighted, and also the staggering vulnerabilities in the integral supply chain that drives the global commerce. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act would be the first major overhaul of federal regulations for the international open ocean shipping industry since 1998. For decades, the United States has run a significant trade imbalance, due in large part to export-driven, non-market economies like mainland China. In 2001, the People's Republic of China was granted permanent normal trade relations with the United States, the so-called most favored nation status, following that country's admission to the World Trade Organization. There has since been a considerable consolidation among the foreign-based ocean carriers, coinciding with the continued decline of the U.S.-flagged international fleet in favor of foreign flags of convenience. A handful of foreign-flagged ocean carriers now dominate the global ocean shipping industry, 3 of which are from China, another from Korea, and a third from Europe. A fifth from Europe, several of which are effectively controlled by these foreign governments. Foreign business access to the American market and our consumers is a privilege. It is not a right. In 2001, the United States trade imbalance with the People's Republic of China was approximately $83 billion in nominal dollars. In 2020, our trade imbalance with the mainland of China was $310 billion, having increased year over year, most every year. This legislation would ensure the reciprocal trade to help reduce the United States' longstanding trade imbalance with export-driven countries like China. California agricultural exporters and other businesses are willing to pay to ensure that their products reach the markets in Asia, but they can't pay a fortune to do it. One example, Jelly Belly, the candy company in my district last spring would pay $3,000 for a container full of candy to ship to the Western Pacific. Today it is $31,900. That's the problem. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act does make critical reforms requested by major U.S. importers like the National Retailer Federation's member companies. There are many, many examples. I'll let those go for now. And with that, I yield back the remainder.
Gentleman
Excuse me.
from
I
California
reserve the
reserves.
balance of my time.
Reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
So it is impossible for any American to ignore the supply chain crunch, a supply chain crunch that seemingly impacts most every part of the American economy. And in that kind of an environment, I want to echo so much of what my friend from California said. I am indeed thrilled that the House is taking up this bill today. I'm grateful for his leadership. I'm grateful to be the lead Republican on this, and I'm grateful that this bill has been endorsed by 360 national, state, and local groups. This is much needed legislation. So how did we get here? With a massive influx of federal dollars into the economy and with COVID-19 changing how Americans purchase goods, for more than a year, United States ports have faced unprecedented volumes of cargo. Some estimates say that American demand for consumer electronics has gone up 40% compared to pre-pandemic. And so the pressure on those ports has trickled down to every other part of the supply chain, leading to what Americans have seen, delays and product shortages. Now, those constraints and the resulting extremely high shipping rates have made it more difficult not just for our country to receive imports, but also for us to ship our manufactured goods and agricultural goods out to the rest of the world. We have seen unprecedented, I'll say it again, we have seen unprecedented rejection of American container loads by the large ocean carriers. They are in contravention of their contractual obligations, just refusing to haul that cargo, preferring instead to take the empty containers and get them back to Asia for a quick turn. That has caused serious problems, not just conceptual, real dollars, real cents. The American dairy industry has seen $1 billion worth of losses just in the first 6 months of this year. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm a big fan of the free market, but the free market is many buyers and many sellers, and that is not in place today. Mr. Garamendi so rightfully talked about the consolidation we have seen in this industry, and indeed 30 years ago, the largest foreign-flagged ocean carriers controlled about 15% of this traffic. Today, they control about 75%. That is not quite the free market that we used to have. And so H.R. 4996 the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, helps to address these supply chain bottlenecks. It helps to promote American competitiveness. And it holds accountable these foreign-flagged ocean carriers, which I would note are increasingly dominated by Chinese state-backed firms. Now, let me be honest and let me be clear, this bill is no silver bullet. But shame on us if we fail to act. This supply chain crunch has laid bare the deficiencies in the marketplace, and we have an opportunity today to address many of those deficiencies. Now, probably the most common question, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues ask of me about this bill is why a congressman from the plains of South Dakota would be so interested in maritime law. I would just remind them of the world's great hunger for American beef, American beans, American corn, and American dairy. Indeed, 60% of South Dakota's soybeans are exported abroad. In that environment, this is not just a coastal issue, but it's an issue that impacts lives from the farm gate to every main street. And indeed, I've been hearing from South Dakota businesses, from Strider Bikes in Rapid City to Valley Queen, a cheese processor in Millbank. And they're telling me about how these issues are having a real impact on dollars and cents. Valley Queen has 2 million pounds of lactose. Now, this is a product that has already been sold to Asian markets, and it's just sitting there in their warehouses, waiting for an opening at the ports. A recent container load of this lactose waited on the ports, Mr. Speaker, for 75 days. The lactose began to turn, and of course that meant a big deduction on the price that Valley Queen could get for that lactose, just a destruction of American value. This bill is about American competitiveness. Broadly speaking, the legislation provides the Federal Maritime Commission, that's the cop on the beat, the tools they need to make sure that this system runs more efficiently and runs more fairly. It makes sure that the interests of the foreign-flagged ocean carriers are better aligned with the interests of American shippers. So the bill does a number of things, but I'll quickly just hit on 5. First off, under this bill, the FMC can set minimum standards for ocean shipping that make sure that U.S. shippers are protected from actions of others which leave export cargoes stranded at U.S. ports. Number 2, it protects U.S. shippers from retaliation if they file a complaint with the FMC. Number 3, this bill prohibits the foreign-flagged ocean carriers from unreasonably denying American export cargo on their vessels. Number 4, it requires foreign ocean carriers to certify the accuracy of the detention and demurrage fees. These are fines that they can hit shippers with. They have to certify that those fines are accurate. And number 5, it would authorize the National Academy of Sciences to study how best to improve transparency in the supply chain. Now, I just don't know, Mr. Speaker, how any of my colleagues could allege that any of these things are not reasonable. These are very basic guardrails. These are very basic rules of the road that people who are using American ports should be obligated to follow. And so a choice for my colleagues is simple. A vote for H.R. 4996 is a vote to put U.S. shippers, manufacturers, farmers, truckers, retailers, and consumers first. That's where they should be. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge support of this legislation, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Dakota reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I'd like to yield, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman that alerted me to this problem way last early summer. Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Congressman John Garamendi, a friend and a person who I've worked with on a host of issues over the years, and Congressman Dusty Johnson. This is I think, a good example of what bipartisan cooperation is all about, and Congressman Garamendi, your leadership in this effort, a member of the subcommittee and the full committee, and Congressman DeFazio, and working out the differences is important. Having said that, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, of which I am co-sponsor, is the first major update in federal regulations for global ocean shipping since 1998. Think about how much the world has changed in 23 years, and in terms of trade. This legislation, as I said, is a result of bipartisan efforts. The legislation supports U.S. exporters who have been disproportionately impacted by unfair trade practices in our ports and harbors. No ship arriving in import should leave an American port empty when products are ready to go, and that's what's happening, sadly. Enacting strong regulatory framework will help end these disruptions to deal with the issue of demurrage and backup on the supply chain that has created this bottleneck. We can and must do more to ensure that all exporters in this country have a fair and level playing field. California agricultural producers, as well as other U.S. exporters, should be able to ship their products without unnecessary delays. It's a national security issue. The increased shipping container costs and delays by exporters are facing only continuing to impact our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me give you a local example. In California, our nation's largest agricultural producer and exporter, with more than 400 commodities and over a third of the nation's vegetables and two-thirds of the nation's fruits and vegetables, 44% of California's agricultural production is exported. 44% of California's agricultural production is exported. The San Pedro Bay Complex, which we otherwise call Los Angeles Long Beach port in Southern California, is the ninth busiest in the world, and provides importation of 40% of the container industry in America. Think about that. This is where the bottleneck is most acute. It's necessary that we utilize all resources to reduce port congestion and empower the Federal Maritime Commission to do what they can and should do. This is about short-term and long-term solutions to relieve the bottleneck in this supply chain. This is about an effort to, in fact, provide relief to that benefits American workers, American consumers. It's about the economic recovery. It's about trade, and it's about jobs. I urge my colleagues to support this important bipartisan piece of legislation that is a part of the short-term and long-term solutions. I recommend a yes vote on this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, reserves. The gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
Before yielding 1.5 minutes to the lady from California, I would just note Mr. Costa's unyielding advocacy of this project, this issue, and thank him for that. And with that, I would yield to Ms. Kim.
The gentlewoman from
minutes,
California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Johnson, for yielding. And I thank you for your passion to address the supply shipping, the crisis that we are facing in our nation today. And I, too, rise today in strong support of Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021. This is a bipartisan bill I was proud to co-sponsor that would help address the container ship bottlenecks at the San Pedro complex, which includes the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in Southern California, nearby my district, California's 39th Congressional District. While this bill is not a silver bullet to resolving all of our supply chain issues, like major labor shortages and warehouse overcapacity, it does take meaningful steps to address uncompetitive practices by some ocean carriers. H.R. 4996 provides the Federal Maritime Commission with more tools to address practices that discriminate against U.S. exporters, importers, truckers, and other players in our supply chain. Continued bottlenecks at the San Pedro complex continue to cause supply disruptions that are raising prices for workers, families, and small businesses, and hurts the ability of our manufacturers and farmers to export goods overseas. So I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4996, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from South Dakota reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington State.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so proud to represent Washington's 8th Congressional District, which stretches from the suburbs of Seattle in the west across the Cascade Mountains into the rich farmland of central Washington. It's home to some of the nation's largest agricultural producers and exporters whose hay, apples, pears, cherries are in high demand all around the world. For more than a year, these exporters have shared with me how pandemic conditions and the behavior of foreign-owned shipping carriers are hurting their industries, threatening export markets and relationships that they have developed over decades. They often don't know when a ship will be in port, making it difficult to get their products to the carrier in time. They're forced to pay additional fees when their products, often perishable ones, have to wait at the port to be loaded onto a ship. And shipping carriers are opting to return as many empty containers to China as possible for fast turnaround and their own bottom line rather than accepting U.S. exports. It is better for them financially to return to China with empty containers to bring back TVs, iPads, and just about everything else we buy from Amazon versus bringing back 8th District hay or agricultural goods. This rejection threatens to upend our nation's agricultural industry and relationships built over decades for years to come. I was proud to co-sponsor the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021 together with Congressmen Garamendi and Johnson. I thank them for their support. This is a great bipartisan bill that will make a real difference for exporters in my district, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington State yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 1.5 minutes to the great gentleman from the great state of Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 4996, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. I thank Mr. Johnson, Mr. Garamendi, and others for joining me in raising the alarm back in March in a letter to the Federal Maritime Commission about the empty container ships leaving American ports. This bill follows on that effort, offering necessary reforms to federal regulations overseeing the ocean shipping industry in order to address problems like have been discussed. Agriculture exports are critical to not only feeding the world, but to the livelihood of the producers I represent in Nebraska. We cannot do that if container ships leave American ports completely empty. This bill prohibits foreign ocean carriers from refusing U.S. exports unreasonably and gives the FMC more tools to ensure these carriers are held accountable and held to a high standard. Trade only works if exports reach their final destination in a reliable and affordable way. This bill is a great step toward facilitating exactly that. It's a reasonable bill. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Nebraska yields back. Gentleman from South Dakota reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cabo.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I would like to express my support for the bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act and bipartisan agreement that Representatives Garamendi and Johnson have reached. I would like to thank my colleagues for working with me and Chair DeFazio on this legislation. As chair of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, I've held hearings on the ongoing supply chain disruption and met with countless stakeholders and constituents who are feeling the impacts of the disruption, including those who suffered wrongdoing by ocean carriers. This legislation is a big step toward addressing this. The increase in funding for the Federal Maritime Commission, FMC, in this 2-year authorization is indicative of this body's strong support for finding an effective solution to the pandemic supply chain crisis. Now is the time to ensure that the Commission has the ability to enforce fairness in ocean carrier practices. I am pleased that the bill contains a number of provisions aimed at addressing wrongfully issued detention and demurrage fees, and complements President Biden's actions to address this issue. The bill also includes several reporting requirements on issues of maritime cargo flow at U.S. ports and anti-competitive business practices. By addressing these challenges, Congress seeks to counter trade imbalances with foreign exporting countries, making reciprocal trade one of the FMC's missions. I am proud of the committee's work on this important legislation, and I look forward to ensuring that this legislation, H.R. 4996, is signed into law. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, reserves. Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
I would thank Mr. Carbajal for his leadership, and I would yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also want to thank Representative Dusty Johnson and Garamendi for their work on this bill. While I support this bill, I do have concerns about the process under which it has been brought to the floor and whether it by itself will have much impact on the supply difficulties we are currently facing. Neither a hearing nor a markup was held on this bill. Given its complexity, I believe a hearing and a markup would have given members a better opportunity to fully understand and perhaps improve the bill. The bill gives the Federal Maritime Commission, the FMC, enhanced authorities to prevent ocean carriers who operate ships in the container trade from engaging in anti-competitive activities with regard to shippers and give shippers enhanced input into the FMC complaint process. I have concerns about giving bureaucrats at the Federal Maritime Commission more authority to insert themselves into privately held contractual agreements. However, it appears to a great extent the delays, port congestion, and higher shipping prices are due primarily to short-term contracts, unwillingness or inability to share data needed by all parties to operate efficiently, equipment shortages, lack of warehouse space, chassis, truck, and train capacity, and labor issues, rather than anti-competitive practices by ocean shippers. If ocean shippers were the sole problem, we would not see container ships waiting for weeks to unload. Ag exports are at record high levels for some commodities, and it is unfortunate that some of the ag shipments have not been able to make it on ships in a timely and efficient manner. However, it is not clear to me that the decision that led to these products from being stranded are due to practices that are anti-competitive under U.S. law. This bill would prohibit carriers from unreasonably declining cargo that can be safely and timely loaded and is going to a port on the ship's itinerary. I'd be curious to see how much this provision is used. As I said, I am willing to support this bill to ensure that detention in demurrage is used as incentive to move cargo efficiently, not, as some have claimed, as an indiscriminate corporate profit center, and to provide shippers some additional protections. However, as has been said by the sponsors, this bill isn't perfect and we still need more work to be done. I expected to address more work to supply chain more broadly and not assume that alleged anti-competitive behavior by ocean carriers is the sole cause for the current supply disruption, and we want more legislation needed. In that legislation, number one, would be comprehensive and look at a long-term port, truck, chassis, train, intermodal connection, and warehouse capacity needs. 2, assure the availability of transparent, enforceable contracts to assure goods can be shipped and agreed to at time and cost. And 3, improve data sharing among the parties and the supply to ensure that everyone knows when, where and when they must have the equipment to move containers efficiently. I urge support of this legislation, and also we continue to work to address the whole supply chain crisis. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from South Dakota reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains on our side?
Gentleman from California has 10 minutes. The gentleman from South Dakota has 7.5.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves California. Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I just want to take an opportunity to thank Chair DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves for the various hearings they've had in talking with Chairman Maffei, Commissioner Dye, and others on the FMC about these issues. I want to thank Mr. Garamendi and others for bringing up this legislation in a number of hearings we've had on the supply chain crunch. And I think it has helped to fill out the record on these incredibly important issues and the role that this legislation can play in advancing this cause. With that, I would yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Johnson, for yielding and your support for this important legislation today. I rise in strong support of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021. Throughout the pandemic, I heard from Georgia farmers who were unable to access affordable shipping. Agriculture is the largest industry in my district and the largest industry in the state of Georgia. Our ports are a critical part of our nation's infrastructure, and it should be considered a great honor and privilege for any international company or entity to have access to them. Foreign players gain access to the largest consumer market on earth through our ports with a GDP of $20 trillion and 325 million people. Yet American farmers face high fees and barriers to getting their commodities into shipping containers. After defying the odds of weather and many other issues that our farmers face, it is unconscionable that our perishable exports are left sitting in warehouses to rot. This bill provides the first significant federal update of the Federal Maritime Commission's powers since 1998 and will significantly improve our farmers' access to affordable shipping. I am a proud co-sponsor of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, and I urge my colleagues to support this important bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from South Dakota reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
I'm prepared to close, sir. So, Mr. Speaker, there are a few things that I know for sure. The first is that when you use American ports, you should be subjected to some very basic rules of the road. Things like not being allowed to unreasonably discriminate against American cargo. That's one thing I know for sure. Another thing I know for sure is that although this bill is not a silver bullet, and nobody is alleging that it is only the ocean carriers that are responsible for the supply chain crunch, this will help. This better aligns the interests of the ocean carriers with the interests of American manufacturers and American farmers and ranchers. That will go a long way toward helping to resolve this supply chain crunch. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, one more thing that I know for sure. And that is when you have 360 national, state, and local groups, when you have 90 members of Congress, when you have a bipartisan coalition that has come together to embrace this concept in what is all too often a partisan environment, then I think you know you have a good policy solution. With that in mind, I once again want to thank the gentleman from California for his leadership, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the bill and ask the Senate for their expeditious consideration of it. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Occasionally we toss words back and forth across the aisle here, and I'd like to toss a word back across the aisle to Mr. Johnson. He said compliments my way, the actual compliments go his way. It's not often that we spend time, and we spend a good deal of time working together on these bills, and we ought to do more across the aisle. Mr. Johnson, it's been a pleasure working with you and your team, and I thank you. I thank you for stepping forward, as have other members on my side and your side of the aisle, stepping forward and say, hey, there's a problem. It's a problem out there. There's problems of retention and demurrage charges that are, whoa, how could that be? An importer of plastic Christmas trees and wreaths and other ornaments from China could not get his containers off of the port. Yet he was being charged $4 million, which pretty much puts him out of business. He's not the biggest company in the world, but he'd like to be. And given the unfair situation that he was facing, he may never become a major company in the United States. So we need to set up rules of the road, words that Mr. Johnson laid out so clearly, rules of the road, the guardrails. Within these rules, operations, free enterprise, market competition can take place. But right now, it is a wide open system in which there's a gunfight on the street. And that is leading to companies not being able to get their goods on the ships to export. In comments that you've already heard from Mr. Costa, California is a big agricultural export, and so is South Dakota, and so is the Midwest, and so is the Southeast. All of America wants to export, but when you cannot get a container, you're not going to export, and you're likely to be out of business. and you're going to incur a very, very significant charge. So we set up a system in which these charges and the availability are regulated in a mechanism that will be conducted by the Federal Maritime Commission. We can go on and on here, and we probably ought to, but I won't take my full 10 minutes. I will say, as Mr. Johnson said earlier, this isn't the silver bullet. This isn't going to solve all the problems. But when you consider what has already occurred in legislation here, specifically the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that piece of legislation will provide $2.5 billion to the ports so that they can upgrade their facilities, so that they can, the next time round, be able to avoid the kind of congestion that is plaguing all of the commerce in this nation. We also look to the Build Back Better legislation, which has another $2.5 billion in it to deal with additional infrastructure that's necessary to connect the ports to the rest of the transportation system in this nation. We need this bill. We, the American farmer, needs this bill. We, the American export industry, whether it's heavy, light, and the import community, all need this bill. And so I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and in that process, we will, I believe, have a much better market system here in the United States, one that has guardrails, one that provides an equitable and balanced system for the importers and the exporters. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentlemen?
I didn't really mean that. I think I still have a minute. And in that minute, I would like to do something very, very important, if I could.
Gentleman's recognized.
Clearly, you must have misheard me, or did I misspeak? Either way, I want to take an opportunity here to thank some very, very important people, the staff that put this together. On our side of the aisle, as soon as I find all of my notes here, yes, Matt Dwyer, the lead person on the Maritime and Coast Guard Committee, Sherry Ann Thompson on that committee, and Cheryl Dickinson and Ian Hart from my own staff. And if Mr. Johnson would like to take a minute of my time to thank his staff.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from South Dakota is recognized.
Yes, I would just echo the thoughts of Mr. Garamendi that there have been so many who've worked together and really a broad national coalition. And he is exactly right to call attention to the people who do the work behind the scenes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, and I yield back.
And this time, I
Gentleman
clearly
from
yield back
California
my
recognized.
remaining time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 4996 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, gentleman from California.
I call for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered, and pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed.